Mark Harper, a black veteran with a decade of military service, had sought refuge in the suburbs, far from the chaos of urban life. His home became a sanctuary, a place to heal from the scars of war. Yet, he knew too well that peace was fragile, especially in a world where his skin color often defined how others treated him. Conflict was not something he sought, but it had a way of finding those who least wanted it. His dog, a German shepherd named Shadow, was more than just a pet. The loyal companion symbolized strength and resilience, qualities Mark relied on as he navigated life's challenges. Their daily walks through the park offered a brief escape from reality, a chance to enjoy the simpler things. That day, as they strolled along the park's winding paths, Mark noticed three men lingering nearby. Their disheveled appearance and loud, boisterous behavior caught his attention. They kicked an empty can along the path, their laughter sharp and mocking. Their gazes, predatory and cold, eventually fixed on him. Shadow, ever attuned to his owner's emotions, tensed beside him. The dog's hackles rose as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Mark's grip on the leash tightened. He knew better than to engage, but ignoring their stares would not make them go away. The men seemed to single him out, their body language radiating a quiet menace. Later, back at home, Mark couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. Those men weren't random troublemakers. Their confidence and demeanor suggested something more dangerous. It wasn't just an isolated incident, they had made it personal. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat by the window, staring into the darkness, every creak and rustle sharpening his senses. The years in the military had trained him to trust his instincts, and now they screamed that something was coming. The next morning, Mark returned to the park, determined to face whatever awaited him. Avoidance was not an option. Shadow walked faithfully by his side, the dog's keen eyes scanning the surroundings. It wasn't long before he spotted the same men standing at the edge of the path. They weren't hiding, and their smirks carried a clear message. They remembered him. Mark's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. Shadow remained close, his muscles taut with readiness. The men's eyes locked on him, their expressions taunting. He didn't falter, walking past them as if their presence didn't matter. Yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Returning home, Mark felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was short-lived. Those men wouldn't let this go. Their stares, their posturing, it was a prelude to something more sinister. Were they seeking control, intimidation, or just violence for its own sake? Mark sat by the window, a mug of coffee in hand, as Shadow rested at his feet. The unease lingered, a constant shadow since that fateful encounter in the park. This was only the beginning. Mark stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street. His eyes lingered on the old oak tree growing near the neighbor's house. Its sprawling branches cast thin shadows across the road, breaking the asphalt into fractured patterns. Shadow lay near the door, his ears perked, lifting his head at every faint noise. Mark had noticed it a few days ago, a car driving past his house far too slowly. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia, but details caught his attention. The same license plate, the faint, dim glow of its headlights, and something deliberate about the way the driver paused near his home. Too often to be a coincidence. By the third day, he found the note in his mailbox. A slip of paper with crudely scrawled words, "Leave our neighborhood while you still can." The harsh pencil strokes had dug so deeply into the paper that faint marks bled through to the back. He held the note, feeling anger bubble under his skin, but his expression remained calm. He tucked it into his desk drawer, determined not to let fear dictate his actions. Still, unease gripped him tightly. At dinner, memories surfaced unbidden. The image of his younger brother, gone too soon, flashed in his mind. David had always been the optimist, the kind of man who sought light even in the darkest corners. But when he was falsely accused of theft, their lives unraveled. Mark remembered the trials, the despair in David's voice during his last prison call. Injustice had stolen his brother, leaving a scar that never healed. The pain of that loss never faded, only dug deeper into his soul. A noise outside broke his thoughts. Shadow growled, rising to his feet, his sharp eyes fixed on the front door. Mark moved cautiously, peering through the peephole. Darkness. But then the sound came again, a dull, rhythmic thud, as though someone was testing his patience. When he opened the door, a sharp scent hit his nostrils. Down the road, figures hurled bottles toward his house. Flames flared briefly before dying out. Shadow darted to the fence, barking and growling. It was enough to send the intruders scrambling, disappearing into the shadows. The acrid smell lingered in the air long after the attackers had gone. The fire hadn't caused damage, but it served as a chilling reminder of how real the threat had become. Sleep evaded him, knowing the next steps would be crucial. Later, he dialed his old friend, Evan Blake. The man answered almost immediately. Their conversation was brief but weighty. Evan listened without interruption, pausing only to say, "They know what they're doing, Mark. You need to know too. Keep Shadow close, lock your windows. Stay sharp at night. Call me if you need anything." After the call, Mark felt his muscles unwind slightly. Evan was a man of his word, and knowing he was there gave Mark a small but vital sense of reassurance. Yet, something unshakable lingered. It wasn't fear but a steady, gnawing dread. Shadow lay silently at his feet, his watchful eyes never straying. The house greeted Mark with an ominous silence. The feeling of emptiness and unease enveloped him the moment he stepped inside. Shadow always heard his approach first, rushing to the door with eager excitement. But today, the silence was heavy, foreboding. Mark froze for a moment, listening. His heart clenched with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. He stepped into the yard, and his eyes immediately spotted something wrong. Shadow's black body lay motionless near the fence. In an instant, everything around him faded away. Mark rushed to the dog, his knees hitting the ground, though he didn't feel the pain. Thick foam rimmed Shadow's mouth, his paws twitched spasmodically, and his cloudy eyes still held a faint glimmer. "Shadow!" His voice trembled, breaking with pain. Mark ran his hand over the dog's head, desperately trying to help. Shadow let out a faint whimper, his gaze shifting weakly to his owner. Mark's eyes caught sight of a piece of meat lying nearby, and everything became clear. Someone had thrown poison. The fiery anger inside him gave way to icy dread. Mark's hands trembled as he tried to find a pulse, any sign of life. He wanted to run, to call for help, but he knew it was too late. Shadow mustered his final strength, nudging his nose closer to Mark's hand. And then came the silence. True, deafening silence. Shadow stopped moving. Mark froze in place, cradling the lifeless body of his dog. Tears streamed down his face, unnoticed. Memories flashed before his eyes. The first time he had seen Shadow as a puppy, their training sessions, the countless moments when Shadow had protected him. And now he was gone. When the initial wave of emotion subsided, Mark carried Shadow's body inside. He carefully wrapped it in an old blanket that had always lain on the couch. Then he called the police. The officers arrived an hour later. 2 men inspected the yard, listening to Mark's account with detached indifference. This could just be a coincidence, one of them said, a tall, bald man. Maybe someone threw poison without realizing there was a dog here. Mark's anger flared. A coincidence? Throwing poisoned meat into someone's yard is a coincidence. The second officer, a stocky man with a beard, tried to calm him. "I understand you're upset. We'll look into it, but cases like this usually don't lead anywhere." Those words struck a deep wound. They weren't even going to try. This wasn't a random incident. It was a deliberate attack, and Mark knew it. He shut the door, leaving the officers outside, and sat by Shadow's body. Bitterness mixed with cold fury. Hours passed. Mark sat in his bedroom, leaving the light on. His gaze fell to the corner where Shadow's bowl used to stand. Now, there was emptiness, and that emptiness screamed. One thing became clear: no one would help him. Not the police, not the system, not the laws. The only one who could ensure justice was himself. Memories of losing his younger brother to the same indifferent system resurfaced. Back then he had been powerless. But not now. This time was different. He wouldn't let the gang get away with this. Shadow had been more than a friend. He was family. And now, Mark would do whatever it took to ensure this didn't go unanswered. Mark sat at the kitchen table, leaning over a pile of notes and documents he had collected over the past few days. His face reflected cold focus, and his eyes revealed a steely determination. Every new detail added clarity to the bigger picture. This gang had connections, influence, and brutality, but they had made a fatal mistake by crossing his path. The name Daryl Kane kept appearing repeatedly. A man with a dark past and an even darker present. Daryl ran his gang like a corporation. Extortion, drug trafficking, illegal weapons. His influence stretched far beyond a single neighborhood. But it was the latest discovery that filled Mark with rage. Daryl had connections within the police, explaining their indifference. Mark clenched his fists. This revelation only fueled his determination. The phone on the table vibrated. Mark glanced at the screen. Evan. He answered briefly, skipping pleasantries. They arranged to meet in an hour at Evan's garage, a place where they wouldn't be disturbed. Mark knew he'd need allies to deal with this. He wasn't a naive hero who relied solely on his strength. When Mark entered the garage, he was met by the serious faces of Evan and Trace. Evan, always precise and punctual, looked much like the man Mark had once served alongside. Trace, on the other hand, appeared rougher, with a weary expression that spoke of the toll life after the military had taken on him. "So, you're sure it's Kane?" Evan asked, wasting no time on formalities. His voice was firm, though tinged with concern. "Certain. He's got it all, money, power, and henchmen willing to do anything." Mark tossed a folder of gathered information onto the table. "We're not dealing with a street gang. This is a full-blown network." Trace opened the folder and began skimming through the documents. "So, he's got cops in his pocket? That explains a lot. You saw how they reacted." "They didn't react," Mark said coldly. "I'm done waiting. We need to act." Evan and Trace exchanged glances. They knew this wouldn't be easy. In the military, they'd faced organized enemies, but here, on home soil, the stakes were different. They weren't just up against a gang, they were fighting a system that protected it. "Fine," Evan finally said. "But we need to prepare. Without a plan, we're just targets?" Trace nodded. "I've got a few old connections. I can get what we need, but it won't happen overnight." Mark knew time wasn't on their side, but rushing in could cost them their lives. He looked at his friends, feeling grateful they had agreed to help. This was their fight now, and they understood what they were getting into. The next few days were spent in preparation. Mark and his team began gathering weapons and equipment. They studied the gang's weaknesses, mapped out their movements, and searched for allies. It soon became clear that Daryl Kane wasn't just running a gang, he was the head of an entire network of operations that brought in millions. Every night, Mark reviewed his plans, thinking about his brother and Shadow. The memories of loss burned within him but also reminded him of why he was doing this. He knew there was no turning back. His life had now narrowed to one purpose: to destroy this gang. Mark gave one last check to the weapons laid out before him. The cold steel still lingered in his hands, a weight both intimidating and reassuring. Every detail of the plan had been meticulously thought out, and he knew there could be no mistakes. The first strike had to be powerful, not just to inflict damage but to sow fear. The target was carefully chosen. One of Daryl Kane's drug storage points sat on the outskirts of the city. An abandoned warehouse hidden among old industrial buildings was the perfect location for his mission. He had watched the place for days, studying the guards' routines, people's habits, and the delivery schedule. Tonight, a truck was scheduled to arrive. It was time to act. Evan and Trace insisted on joining him, but Mark was firm. This was his battle. They could help later, but for now, this needed to be between him and his enemies. He took position on the roof of a derelict building opposite the warehouse. From here, he had a full view of the entrance, the trucks, and the guards. A knife hung at his waist, grenades sat in his pockets, and a rifle was slung across his back. Mark stayed motionless, a predator in wait, watching for the perfect moment. The truck's headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the muddy path leading to the warehouse. The vehicle stopped, and 3 men stepped out. Behind them, more people emerged from the building. One of them, clearly the shift leader, was barking orders. Mark remained still, observing as the truck doors opened and the men began unloading boxes. He counted the seconds. Everything was happening on schedule, like clockwork. When the time came, Mark pulled out the grenades. The first one landed at the feet of the 3 men near the truck, shattering the silence with a deafening explosion. Chaos erupted. The men scattered, trying to find cover, but Mark was faster. One by one, they fell to his precise shots. Each bullet was deliberate, devoid of emotion. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated execution. 2 men tried to escape through the back exit. Mark caught up to them, narrowly dodging a shot from one of them. The hand-to-hand combat was brief but intense. Soon, both were lying on the ground. Inside the warehouse, Mark left his message. In bold red spray paint on the wall, he wrote, "This is for Shadow." They needed to understand that this was just the beginning. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time. The warehouse was ablaze, flames consuming everything inside. Leaving evidence wasn't usually his style, but in this case, he wanted them to know who had started this war. By the next morning, news of the attack had spread throughout the city. Daryl knew it was Mark. He didn't doubt for a second who had left the message. The gang was panicking. They were used to being untouchable, and now they faced a threat they couldn't control. Daryl gathered his men and put a bounty on Mark. He couldn't let this attack go unanswered. Evan and Trace met Mark at a designated spot. Trace paced nervously while Evan sat across from Mark, his gaze unyielding. "Do you understand what you've done?" Evan asked, his tone firm but quiet. "They'll come after you now. Every step will be dangerous." "Let them try," Mark replied, his voice as cold as ice. "I won't back down. This is war." Evan shook his head. "You realize they might hit back even harder. You need to be ready for this to escalate." Mark rose in silence. There was an unyielding resolve in his eyes. He knew there was no turning back. This was his path now. Mark sharpened his senses, catching every sound, every whisper. The trees outside seemed alive, their branches rasping warnings of the danger looming closer. He knew the gang wouldn't let his actions go unanswered, and waiting for their retaliation gnawed at him. They would come, it was only a matter of when and how. A sound broke the usual stillness. It wasn't the crack of a branch under an animal's paw, but something deliberate and heavy. Mark stood in the kitchen, his rifle resting on the table nearby. Instinct locked him in place before he crouched, grabbed the weapon, and moved to a wall. A dull thud at the front door. Not waiting for a second, Mark pressed himself to the shadows, his grip firm on the rifle. One knock followed another, then the sharp sound of shattering glass. They were here. The intruders moved with precision, their steps confident, as though rehearsed. Mark heard them enter, 3 of them. Another sound, a signal or perhaps a simple gesture, split them apart. It was a mistake. The first fell to a single shot through a gap between the door and frame, leaving no time to react. Chaos erupted as the others opened fire, riddling the room with bullets and turning it into a war zone. Mark knew his house better than they ever could. He moved swiftly, using shadows and cover. The second fell by the staircase, stunned by a sharp strike from Mark's rifle butt. The last one approached with steady confidence, but Mark waited for him in the corner. Their confrontation lasted seconds, ending with the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. When silence returned, Mark scanned the room. Gunpowder and tension hung thick in the air. In the corner, movement caught his eye, a young man clutching a bleeding shoulder. "Don't kill me," the boy cried, his voice trembling the moment he realized Mark had spotted him. Mark stepped closer, his rifle aimed. The wound wasn't deep, but blood streamed freely. "Who sent you?" Mark's voice was cold, cutting through the stillness. "They made me," the boy stammered. "Said they'd kill my family if I didn't go." Fear radiated from his eyes, unfiltered and raw. Mark felt a strange weight settle over him. For so long he had seen his enemies as faceless puppets of Daryl Kane, but this boy was as much a victim as anyone. Mark's gaze shifted. The fight was far from over, but doubt crept into his resolve for the first time. Was this justice, or just more destruction? In the boy's pockets, Mark found folded papers. Among them were maps and notes. As he unfolded them, the truth became clear. these weren't just documents. They were the key to a hidden weapons and money cache outside the city. Clutching the papers, Mark realized they would bring him closer to Kane. But the trembling boy's face lingered in his mind. Mark knew all too well the trap of circumstances that left no room for escape. Leaving the house, Mark ensured the boy was bound but unharmed. His next goal lay ahead, the cache that would cripple Kane's operations. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling, forming chaotic patterns that vanished before they could be deciphered. Daryl Kane sat at a heavy wooden desk, his fingers drumming against the polished surface. He listened as his men recounted the recent attacks. Mark had become more than a nuisance. He was a threat that needed to be eliminated. His eyes, sharp as embers, narrowed when one of his men suggested using a trap. "Use Evan Blake," he ordered in a gravelly tone. "That bastard will come for his friend. He won't have a choice." Meanwhile, Mark meticulously studied the documents and maps he'd gathered. His findings at Kane's cache revealed connections, addresses, and supply routes. But the thought of Daryl continuing to manipulate the system gnawed at him. A phone call broke his concentration. On the other end, Evan spoke quickly, barely catching his breath. "They've found me, Mark." His voice trembled but remained steady. "They're going to use me against you." A cold dread gripped Mark's chest. He knew it was a trap but couldn't leave his friend to fend for himself. Quickly gathering what he needed, he headed to the designated location, a derelict warehouse on the city's outskirts. The warehouse appeared deserted, but Mark didn't trust the calm facade. He took cover behind piles of scrap metal, scanning the area intently. Listening carefully, he detected the faint movement of shadows inside. Suddenly, a commotion arose as a group of men emerged, surrounding Evan. His friend's hands were bound, his face bloodied. One of the thugs shoved Evan to the ground. "Come to play hero, Mark?" Daryl's voice echoed mockingly. "Let's see what you've got." Mark didn't reply. He opened fire, aiming with precision to neutralize his enemies. Bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces, creating a cacophony that mixed with the shouts and commands of the gang members. Time was running out. Mark moved swiftly, firing and taking cover, gradually reducing their numbers. Evan found himself between two thugs, one pointing a gun directly at his head. Mark knew this was his only chance. A long-distance shot was risky, but he didn't hesitate. His aim was true, and the thug collapsed before he could react. The second stumbled back, giving Mark the opening to rush forward and drag Evan out of harm's way. The firefight continued. Daryl managed to escape, but Mark decided to cripple the gang by destroying the warehouse. He located fuel tanks, ignited them, and the flames quickly spread. The explosion rocked the area as fire consumed the structure. Evan's breaths were labored, his face pale from blood loss. Mark hoisted him onto his shoulder and hurried away before the police or gang reinforcements could arrive. Once they were safe, Evan, struggling to speak, shared crucial information. "I overheard them talking about an old motel in the mountains. I think Daryl's hiding there." Those words became the next lead. Mark knew the next step would be even more dangerous, but there was no turning back. The quiet crunch of boots on damp gravel blended with the muffled sounds of the forest. Mark stood at the edge of the clearing, observing Daryl Kane's hideout, a derelict factory surrounded by dense woods. It had taken him days to gather the intel to locate this place, and he wasn't about to let the opportunity slip. Tension mixed with resolve. Tonight, it would all end. Mark had a plan, meticulously crafted and calculated. Using the documents he'd found earlier and Evan's support as a coordinator despite his injuries, Mark prepared for a guerrilla-style assault. Swift strikes, targeted destruction, and withdrawal before reinforcements could arrive. He would rely on his military training. The factory's perimeter was guarded by armed men. Mark's first move was to take out the sentry at the main gate silently and without alarm. His objective was clear: sow chaos, make the gang scatter and lose cohesion. He rigged explosives at key points around the compound, planting charges on fuel tanks and parked vehicles. The first explosion shook the ground. Flames shot into the sky, illuminating the darkness. Panicked gang members poured out of the building, shouting in confusion as they searched for the source of the attack. Hidden among the shadows, Mark began firing with precision, picking them off one by one. Each shot was deliberate, each movement calculated. Bullets struck their targets as if the forest itself had risen against those who defiled its silence. Inside the building, shouts and orders echoed. One of Daryl's lieutenants barked commands, rallying the others to defend the base, but it was futile. Mark had already infiltrated the structure through a side entrance. Moving quickly and staying unseen, he encountered and eliminated opposition at every turn, his experience giving him the upper hand. Finally, Mark found Daryl in the central chamber of the factory, surrounded by crates of weapons. Daryl smirked as he spotted Mark, drawing his gun. "Come to die." Daryl taunted, aiming his weapon. "No, to finish what you started," Mark replied, raising his own gun. Their fight began with gunfire but quickly escalated into close combat. Mark knew Daryl was strong, but anger and grief fueled his strength. The blows were brutal, each one carrying the weight of Mark's resolve. The metallic clash of weapons, grunts, and the sound of collapsing structures filled the room. Mark managed to knock Daryl to the ground, but the gang leader activated a hidden mechanism. A section of the floor opened, and Daryl disappeared into a secret tunnel leading out of the factory. Mark rushed to follow, but a sudden explosion forced him back. The hidden escape route was destroyed. Blood seeped from a wound on his side, and his breathing was labored. Despite the pain, Mark refused to give up. He emerged from the building, leaving the burning ruins of the gang's hideout behind. He had crippled their operations, but his primary target had escaped once more. Standing atop a hill, he watched the factory burn. Rage and determination churned within him. This wasn't over. Daryl might have slipped away, but not forever. Mark clenched his fists, vowing to continue the hunt. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small kitchen, unable to mask the storm of anger and determination brewing inside Mark. He sat at the wooden table, staring at the documents and flash drives spread before him. Each piece was a testament to his relentless efforts: recordings, photos, evidence exposing Daryl Kane's ties to corrupt officials and police. These were his weapons. Yet instead of triumph, he felt an emptiness gnawing at him. Mark couldn't afford doubt. He carefully packed the materials into a neat envelope and prepared a letter for the journalist he trusted most. Emma Carter was not just a talented reporter, she was known for her fearlessness and integrity. No one could manipulate or intimidate her, and that was precisely what was needed to let the truth see the lights. Within hours, the envelope was in Emma's hands. She met Mark at an unassuming cafe, where he handed over everything he had gathered. Her face showed a mixture of professional interest and concern, but as she opened the envelope, she merely nodded silently. "They'll try to stop you," she said quietly, closing the folder. "This could be the start of something much bigger." "Let them try," Mark replied firmly, his eyes blazing with resolve. The work began almost immediately. The first articles, based on the data Mark provided, caused a stir. Local newspapers and news channels exploded with reports of police corruption, secret deals, and high-ranking officials' criminal ties to Daryl's gang. The public was outraged. Crowds took to the streets with signs demanding justice. The city was gripped by a wave of protests. Over the following weeks, the revelations swept through the city like a storm. Several high-ranking officials were forced to resign, and the police chief found himself under investigation. Justice seemed to be taking shape at last. But for Mark, it was only half the battle. Every evening, he returned home with a nagging sense that something vital was missing. Daryl was still out there. Hiding somewhere beyond the city's reach, he remained untouchable. That knowledge tormented Mark more than he cared to admit. His hands were tied by a system that repeatedly proved its inability, or unwillingness, to hold Daryl accountable. One evening, sitting in the dim light of his living room, Mark stared at a photograph of Shadow. The dog, who had been his companion, protector, and reminder of the past, had died because of Daryl's impunity. That loss fueled his determination even more. A phone call interrupted his thoughts. On the other end was Evan. "I know you won't give up," Evan said, as if reading Mark's mind. "But you've taken a step no one else would dare to take?" Mark didn't reply. His silence spoke volumes. Exposing the truth hadn't brought him satisfaction. It was only the first battle in a war that was far from over. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, holding a folded piece of paper that had arrived earlier. The seal on the envelope was unfamiliar, and the text inside was brief but sharp, like a dagger. Daryl Kane spotted in the next state. Possible route marked below. There was no signature, but the style of the note was familiar. Evan. The one person who understood that for Mark, this hunt would never end until justice was served. He set the note aside, then ran his hand over the worn wooden nightstand, where his keys, wallet, and knife lay. Each item felt like a symbol of the path he had walked. On the wall hung Shadow's collar, the last reminder of his loyal companion whose life had been cut short by this war. His gaze lingered on it, as if the dog's eyes still looked back at him, urging him forward. Mark stood and opened the dresser drawer where he kept his essentials. He checked the weapons he had gathered over the months: a handgun, a knife, a bulletproof vest. Beside them lay an old military tag, the only relic of a past where he had once been a soldier, believing in order and justice. That tag wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of the faith he had lost in a system that now only hindered his fight. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message flashed on the screen: "Be careful. He might not be alone." The warning was from Evan, too weak to fight alongside him now but always vigilant. Mark nodded, as if his friend could see him. They didn't need words to understand each other. The bag was already packed, but Mark didn't rush. He stepped out of the house and stopped by his car. The sun cast a warm glow over the surroundings, but to him it meant nothing. His world remained in shadow as long as Daryl roamed free. He checked his weapons again, ensured the gas tank was full, and slid into the driver's seat. The road stretched ahead, quiet and serene. Mark knew this moment was just the calm before the storm. His thoughts lingered on what he was leaving behind. The town that was beginning to change thanks to the documents he had exposed. The people who were finally finding their voices. But inside him, there was no joy or relief. None of it mattered while the man who had caused him so much pain still breathed. Stopping at a gas station, Mark caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. A tired face, etched with lines, told of countless battles. But his eyes remained the same, cold as ice, burning with fury. He looked away, paid for the fuel, and moved on. The car sped forward, leaving behind the town, the houses, the familiar faces. Wind rushed through the cracked window, a reminder of the freedom he always sought. For Mark, freedom meant one thing: the ability to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The road eventually brought him to the state line. Mountains loomed in the distance, seemingly insurmountable, but Mark knew no barrier could stop him. He cut the engine and stepped out to survey the horizon. For a moment, he thought he heard Shadow's voice, a deep, loyal bark that had always urged him forward. But it was only his imagination. Mark pulled the paper from his pocket, the route marked clearly. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but with a mix of anger and resolve. Deep down, he knew the hunt for Daryl was more than revenge. It was a way to prove to himself that he could still fight, still make the world a little cleaner. Folding the map, he climbed back into the car and started the engine. The wheels turned once more, carrying him forward into the unknown. Behind him lay the long shadow of the town, and ahead, an even darker road. But Mark didn't look back. His path was clear, even if it led to the edge of the abyss. One last glance at the setting sun. His grip on the wheel was steady as ever. Mark knew a battle awaited him, and he was ready for it.